may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
Okay, guys, I have a massive announcement here. Okay, so not only do we have that $500 league giveaway with that $6,000 league pot over there on Patreon right now, but for everybody supporting the show on Patreon, we also just posted our official Dynasty rankings. Now, I know the demand for this has been very, very high, and I've been kind of holding out on y'all, but it was for a good reason. I wanted to make sure we were spending the adequate time that I was going to be able to have a confident set of rankings with tiers. That way we could go through, make one post, and then not necessarily have to continue to tweak it every single week that I flip back and forth on a single player in a tier. So yes, there will be updates to those rankings and tiers over there on Patreon through the rest of the offseason, but they're going to only be whenever we have a big piece of news. They're only going to be if we have a trade, an injury, just a major thing that a coach says during OTAs, maybe like what we have with the Minnesota Vikings, just nonstop talking trash on Irv Smith Jr. But yeah, I am very excited to announce that. And what we are going to be doing in this video is we are going to be talking about some wide receivers that I don't understand their dynasty value. I mean, in our most recent Flock Patreon Dynasty leagues, they're going way too high, and I think it's time to sell because their value could potentially be taking a nosedive next offseason. But before we get into the players, go down there, drop that like, leave a comment telling me why I'm stupid with these guys, subscribe to the channel if for whatever reason you haven't subscribed already, and let's dive into it with our first wide receiver in Kenny Golladay. Okay, so the first thing we need to address with Golladay is this is a player going into his age 28 season. So we understand when a wide receiver hits this mark, there is nothing that he can do to increase in dynasty value. If you look historically with what has happened over the past 5 years, please leave a comment with a wide receiver that was able to increase his dynasty value that was being drafted within the top 100 picks of a startup in his age 28 or beyond season. Because I would be very surprised if you were able to pull a name out of your ass here. And that is not to say that a wide receiver that is past this age is not worth drafting in Dynasty, because a lot of the times you can get a significant discount on a wide receiver that is beyond his prime and that is not necessarily going to be able to continue to rise in Dynasty value if you like the projection for his production over the next 3 to 4 seasons. I mean, drafting a DeAndre Hopkins, drafting a Tyler Lockett, drafting an Adam Thielen isn't necessarily bad for a contending team where you're looking for production over the next 3 years. Of course, it's just all about the value that you're going to be doing so. And here with Kenny Golladay, that's what's in question here. His value that he's been going in these Flock Patreon Dynasty leagues is way too high, in my opinion. Now, I will be the first person to say that Kenny Golladay got a very nice contract this offseason. Now, y'all know I am always out here talking about how NFL contracts are fake, how they're always front-loaded, and how the team can get out of a player usually after 2 seasons. So you don't necessarily want to be looking at the overall numbers. You really need to dive into the contract details. And yeah, I mean, you pull up the contract details here for Kenny Golladay, and he has some guaranteed money to go along with this big number, and he's guaranteed through the 2023 season. So this is a wide receiver that has a nice contract, and that is definitely something working in his favor. But what is not working in his favor is he is going so low right now in high-stakes redraft leagues. In high-stakes redraft leagues, Kenny Golladay is currently the wide receiver 24 off the board, which is significant because we understand that his dynasty value is primarily fueled with what you're going to be having for his production in the 2021 and the 2022 season. So if that production isn't necessarily going to be sky high, you have to question his dynasty value because you're not looking at a long-term outlook here. You're looking at the immediate production you're getting after the draft. And here, you actually have in redraft leagues, Adam Thielen, Cooper Kupp, and Tyler Lockett all going ahead of Kenny Golladay. And now the reason we bring up those names is because those are all very similar wide receivers. I mean, they're guys that you're drafting for their production over the next 2 to 3 years. You're not drafting them for their dynasty value to increase. So it's significant that all 3 of those guys are going higher in redraft leagues when Kenny Golladay is significantly more valuable right now in dynasty formats. And now, I don't want to necessarily just look at fake dynasty ADP from mock drafts. That's not that useful. what I'd prefer to do is I'd prefer to go through and actually look at what you have with Kenny Golladay in real Dynasty startup drafts that we've done over there on Patreon over the past few weeks. In the Flock 15, Kenny Golladay was drafted as the wide receiver 27. Now you go through and look at who he was drafted ahead. He was drafted ahead of Tyler Lockett, which we've already discussed as an option going ahead of him in redraft leagues. He was drafted ahead of Robert Woods, which, my God, I don't understand that one at all. I mean, Robert Woods, I would take 10 times out of 10, understanding both players are for their upcoming season's projection. And also, he was drafted ahead of both DJ Chark and Juju Smith-Schuster, which neither one of those wide receivers you're expecting to be more productive than Kenny Golladay this upcoming season, but they are being drafted only a round after him in redraft leagues, and both DJ Chark and Juju Smith-Schuster are only 24 years old. So in the case of both Chark and Juju, they actually have the potential to rise in dynasty value if they have an impressive season in 2021. So this price point here for Kenny Golladay makes no sense whether you're going youth, whether you're going with a productive veteran right away, because I think on both ends of the spectrum, Kenny Golladay doesn't necessarily make up the price tag. Now, in the Flock 14, this draft completed 2 weeks ago. Kenny Golladay was drafted as the wide receiver 28. Here, he was drafted ahead of DJ Chark, Deontay Johnson, Courtland Sutton, and Tyler Lockett. I mean, a very similar thesis here. I mean, a Courtland Sutton is only being drafted a few rounds after him in redraft leagues, but Courtland Sutton, also a player that's only 25 years old. You can easily see his value rising if he does hit this upcoming season. And this is not even to mention the names that are going a round or 2 rounds after him that are young. I mean, you have Laviska Shenault, Rashad Bateman, Rondell Moore, Elijah Moore, all going after Kenny Golladay in every single startup draft. So yeah, I mean, the price tag is very, very high. And I understand that you look at Kenny Golladay, and he's been productive over the past 2 years. He was highly productive back in 2019. And in 2020, he was actually the wide receiver 14 in points per game before the injury. I know if you include the injury, he's down there in the wide receiver 30s range, but that's not fair to do to him at all because he literally didn't log a single reception in the game that he left due to that hip injury. So no, he was a high-end wide receiver too this past season. But there was no wide receiver in the NFL that gets a bigger downgrade at the quarterback position than Kenny Golladay going from Matthew Stafford over to Daniel Jones. Now, how we want to be evaluating the efficiency of these respective quarterbacks is by using yards per adjusted pass attempt, where this is very similar to just yards per pass attempt, but they adjust it with the formula based on touchdowns and interceptions included as well. So it's significantly better than just looking at yards per pass attempt. And in 2019, Matthew Stafford was near the top of the league with 8.6 adjusted yards per pass attempt. I mean, absolutely ridiculous there with what he was able to accomplish with Kenny Golladay. Now in 2019, you also had Daniel Jones down there near the bottom of his league in his rookie season at 6.6. And in 2020, Matthew Stafford does fall down to 7.9, but still an above average mark for a starting quarterback at the NFL level. And Daniel Jones falls to being one of the, if not the worst quarterback in the NFL with a 6.1 yards per adjusted pass attempt in 2020. So you're going to be expecting a significant downgrade at quarterback. And what I really want to look at is how Kenny Golladay plays the wide receiver position. Because you go through and you look at the air yards per target for Kenny Golladay in that massive season that he had in 2019. You don't know what air yards per target is. It's essentially how far down the field the wide receiver is at the time the quarterback throws the ball to him. So you know if a wide receiver is operating as a deep threat, you know if a wide receiver is operating closer to the line of scrimmage. And here Kenny Golladay was actually third in air yards per pass attempt in the NFL, only behind Mike Williams and Rashad Perriman. And the reason we are bringing this up is because we understand that if you're that deep threat wide receiver, if you are running routes significantly farther down the field than the players in the slot, than the running back coming out of the backfield, what you need is you need to make sure that your quarterback has time in the pocket to be able to release that pass. And the problem here with Daniel Jones and the New York Giants is right now, PFF has the New York Giants graded out as the worst offensive line in football for this upcoming season. And now I understand a lot of people have problem with PFF's grades, and that's completely fine to have. But I mean, it's more so looking at this team through a ballpark lens. I mean, I don't think PFF is going to have them graded as the worst offensive line in the league if they are in the top 10 or if they are average. I think at the very least, we can say that this is a far below average unit given the fact that they are graded out last. So please understand that this is going to be a very difficult situation for Kenny Golladay to be productive this upcoming season. And you understand that he is being drafted about the same in Dynasty as high stakes redraft leagues. And it makes no sense at all, in my opinion. I mean, I think Kenny Golladay should be going a round or two after. And this is coming from someone who drafted him a lot in Dynasty leagues 2-3 years ago. So I have Golladay on a decent amount of rosters. But right now, I promise you, I'm going to be going and trying to sell him away. So if you're in a Flock Patreon league and you're playing in a league where I have Kenny Golladay, check your inbox, because I promise you probably have an offer sitting out there where I'm trying to get rid of him. Okay, so now let's go to one of my favorite wide receivers, another guy that I have in a lot of leagues. Let's go to Odell Beckham Jr. So a couple of weeks ago, I believe, I made a video over there on the main fantasy football channel where we were just talking about the projection for Odell Beckham Jr. this upcoming season and if he was in line to bounce back with the Cleveland Browns or not. And I came away with the thought that I really had no idea. I mean, it is so hard to evaluate Odell with what you're going to be expecting this season. So how we need to view this is we need to view this through a range of outcomes lens. And we need to understand that those high stakes redraft players are giving us a decent mark to at least begin our analysis with, where they are drafting Odell Beckham Jr. as the wide receiver 32 in high stakes redraft leagues. So Odell is currently being drafted as a mid wide receiver 3 or a low end wide receiver 3 in high stakes redraft leagues. He's going to be 29 this upcoming season. And if you're looking at that Odell Beckham Jr. contract, after this year, he is owed $0 on the dead cap. $0. Now, this is significant. I am a massive Odell Beckham Jr. fan, but we have to understand the risk that you are taking here by investing into Odell in Dynasty. Because let's say that you invest into Odell Beckham Jr. All of a sudden, he comes out, and in fantasy, he is a mid wide receiver 3, just like the high stakes redraft community is thinking he is going to be. And then at that point, next offseason, the Cleveland Browns are facing themselves in a decision where they have to go, you know what, are we going to be paying Odell Beckham Jr. $15 million? Are we going to move on from him, use that $15 million elsewhere on this roster, possibly bring in a Chris Godwin, possibly bring in a Juju Smith-Schuster, a Will Fuller, a Cortland Sutton, or any of the draft picks that we should have this year? And I think that Odell Beckham Jr. really is going to have to show out to make him worth that contract. Because you go through right now and you see Odell over the past few seasons has been absolutely horrendous. I mean, in 2020, Odell Beckham Jr. in fantasy drafts, in redraft leagues in particular, was being drafted as the wide receiver 12 in ADP. And he finished as the wide receiver 37 in points per game. And that was mainly fueled off of just one big performance where there were a few fluky plays in there where, I mean, he had a jet sweep out of the backfield where he took to the house on like a 40-yard rushing touchdown. That was beautiful, but at the same time, it's not something you can project season to season. And he also had a gimmicky play where Jarvis Landry hit him with the bomb, or Odell Beckham Jr. threw it to Jarvis Landry. Can't exactly remember right now, but two gimmicky plays fueled the wide receiver 37, so a high-end wide receiver 4 performance for Odell Beckham Jr. this past year. Then he tears his ACL in week 7, and all of a sudden, I mean, this is a player that is definitely not looking like he's worth that contract for the Cleveland Browns. And in 2019, we saw a very similar thing here, where in 2019, Odell Beckham Jr. was being drafted as the wide receiver 7 in redraft leagues, and he finishes as the wide receiver 35 in points per game. So I will say that, I mean, if you look at that 2019 season where he averaged 8.5 targets a game, 65 receiving yards a game, and he had 4 total touchdowns on that season, maybe that makes you like Odell Beckham Jr. with his price tag as being a low-end wide receiver 3 in redraft leagues this upcoming year. But for Dynasty, when we've already discussed the fact that you draft a wide receiver at 28, 29 years old, you're drafting him for his production. You're not drafting him for any kind of trade value or any kind of bump over the next few seasons. I mean, what are you doing with Odell Beckham Jr. here? Because in the past 2 Flock Patreon leagues, Odell Beckham Jr. was drafted almost at the same mark that he's being drafted in redraft leagues, which makes no sense. I mean, in the Flock 14, he was drafted as the wide receiver 36. This was a super flex startup. Mac Jones was drafted one pick before. Daniel Jones was drafted after him. And Daniel Jones, a very bad real life NFL quarterback, but it's a super flex dynasty league. Daniel Jones can pick up some rushing yards. I mean, he was drafted behind Rondell Moore, Terrace Marshall. I'm sorry, he was drafted ahead of those players, ahead of Adam Thielen as well. And in the Flock 15, you saw something very similar here. He was drafted as the wide receiver 36 as well. He was drafted ahead of Curtis Samuel. He was drafted ahead of Daniel Jones. So it just makes no sense to be looking at an Odell Beckham Jr. that only has 1 year under contract for this upcoming season, an Odell Beckham Jr. that's going to be 29 years old this season, for him to be drafted at the same mark in both Dynasty and Redraft. If you like Odell, draft him in Redraft, but sell him in Dynasty because the price difference here makes no sense. Now, thank you, my dudes. I really hope y'all enjoyed this video. Of course, go down there, drop that like, leave that comment, subscribe to the channel. Make sure that we continue to grow the flock. And yeah, our full Dynasty Patreon rankings are down there in the comments, down there to the description of the video. I'm sure y'all know how to find them. And have a great day, my dudes. Thank you to everybody supporting the show. We got some new members of the flock, and Robert, Caden, Matt, Robbie, Dan, John, Ziggy, Blake, Oliver, and Devin. Thank you, my dudes.